Hey, this is Shawn Thomas, and welcome to the Worship Together podcast, featured exclusively here on our Worship Together social media feed. This program is part of our ongoing outreach to create an online community of faith where believers can support one another and share their life experiences and testimonies, and most importantly, worship together. Each podcast episode is part of a 3-part series, and each series will focus on a variety of topics, and sometimes we'll even feature a guest host. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this Worship Together podcast episode. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Worship Together podcast. My name is Shawn Thomas, and in this 3-part series, we are talking about songs and expressions specifically in worship. And last week, for part 1, we discussed worship songs versus contemporary Christian music, and we compared and contrasted and defined what the difference is between the two, and even some things to consider when planning music for worship services. And today, we're ready for part 2 of the series, which is called Worship Song Snob, which we'll dive into in just a bit. And then the third part of the series on songs and expressions, which we'll cover next Friday, and I've joked about, might just be the most controversial of all, because we're going to be talking about clapping in church. So last week I mentioned that kind of our overall umbrella concept for all 3 of these parts having to do with songs and expressions is the fact that there's pretty much infinite ways to express ourselves in worship and in worship music, which is why every church's worship service is different. And that makes sense because God in his wisdom made no two of us the same. And so it follows that the worship of that same God would reflect the vast diversity of his creation. And as a real quick reminder, I shared a quote from someone named Jeremy Buzzard, who serves as music at a church in Columbia, South Carolina. And part of that quote says, "We must not make the mistake of believing that any particular style of worship music is superior to any other. Every week we declare together the worth of God through our worship, but it's far too easy to fall into the trap of ascribing glory to our personal preferences. We may quickly find ourselves in dangerous territory when we think, quote, well, we sang that song, I don't like that song, or quote, we sang my favorite song, so worship was great today. It's not wrong to have preferences about songs or styles, but we should take caution with this type of consumeristic thinking about our worship services." And again, that was just part of the full quote, but it does help us kind of set the table for our discussion around songs and expressions in church, helping us to keep our minds open and hopefully gain some new perspective and understanding. Okay, so let's get into this. Today's episode is called Worship Song Snob. And of course, a snob is a person who believes that their tastes in a particular area are superior to someone else's tastes. And I think that kind of more a modern definition or use of that word also just sometimes means that it's someone who likes or prefers a particular kind of something, but not every kind of that something. So like maybe you could be a chocolate snob because you only like white chocolate, or a fashion snob because you only like a certain brand of clothing, or a book snob because you only read certain kinds of books and plots. And you can even flip the whole thing around where you're a snob because you don't like a particular kind of something, but you like all the rest. Like maybe you're convinced that a certain make or model of a truck is inferior, but you don't have a problem with trucks in general, right? So these are all examples and can apply to music as well that is used in our worship services. We've got folks who believe that their taste is just better than everyone else's, right? And we've got folks who only like certain kinds or styles of music in church. And we've got folks who might actually like a variety of musical style in worship, except for that one specific style or type of music that they just really don't like at all. Now, Brian will tell you that I have been known to be a comedy movie snob. I'm just not a slapstick, silly kind of movie person. Brian, he loves them, and he just laughs and he laughs, and I'm sitting there with a look of absolute disdain on my face. Like, how could anyone think this is funny? And I use the word disdain because that word implies that whatever it is so bad that it's not even worthy of your attention or response. And that's totally me with these kinds of movies. I'm looking at Brian like, now, how in the world can you be laughing at that? It's not even funny. And meanwhile, I sit wallowing in my self-imposed misery, and Brian is having a ball. He's just smiling and even clapping and sometimes falling over himself with laughter. Now, you may be thinking that where I'm going with the story is that over time and over the years, I've grown to appreciate slapstick comedies and I even enjoy them, and that all I had to do was just give them a chance. And then I'm going to try to tell you, you should do the same thing with music in church that you don't like. Just give it a chance. Well, nope, that is not where I'm going, because I don't care how long or how many of those movies I'm forced to watch, I will never like them. But I will admit that something did shift for me over time, and that was the ability to share in Brian's joy. I love him, and I love to see him happy, and I especially love to hear and see him laugh. It's wonderful. And I'm not sure when it happened, probably not in an instant or anything like that, but at some point, I did become conscious of how much fun Brian has when watching these kinds of movies. And somehow I was able to step out of myself, out of my disdain, of my snobbery, and guess what started to happen? It was like the Grinch's heart, in the Grinch Stole Christmas, the growing 3 sizes when he realizes that there's more to this Christmas thing than he thought. As I sat there through one of these horribly ridiculous movies, one after the other over the years, my attention switched from the movie to Brian. And at first, I started to smile and then even chuckle a little. And then in response to one of Brian's full-bodied outbursts of hysterical laughter, I couldn't help but burst into laughter myself because he was too funny. He had so much fun watching these things that he's seen probably more times than either one of us has even been to church. And yet his joy is never any less than the first time he watched it. And finally, something inside of me was able to recognize his joy and even experience it with him, even though nothing about my opinion of the movies themselves had changed. Suddenly, we were laughing together. Think about a time that you have criticized another church. Come on, you've done it, and I have probably recently. We see and hear about another congregation doing something, or we perceive that they're doing something that we don't align with, or that's not appropriate or correct or the right way to do something, and we have this knee-jerk response because, well, number one, we're only human, and two, because it's not how we think church should be done. One of the things I remember as a child when my family traveled is that my dad, who is a retired pastor, he would occasionally take us to churches that were not like ours. Not all the time, but enough that I remember it and enough that it exposed me to and really made me aware of the fact that we just don't all do it the same. And while I obviously didn't perceive it, that consciously as a kid, as an adult, I think the exposure really did help me appreciate that even if I don't get it exactly, as long as we're still talking about the same God and Christian foundational beliefs, that stuff that other churches do in worship that may not be in my comfort zone might just be reaching someone in a way that my preferred worship style would never reach them. And so when I did grow up, what I really started to notice was how sometimes what other churches did could really be a hot topic issue for some folks. I mean, they really get worked up about it. And I think, sometimes I'd be like, wow, that is a lot of energy and emotion to give over to something that really doesn't affect us and presumably is ministering to someone else's heart. So how in the world could there be anything wrong with that? And again, all this is within the framework of still being based in scriptural and Christian foundational beliefs. So now think of your favorite hymn or worship song and think about how it makes you feel to sing it, or even better, when you hear the introduction for it in church and you're about to sing it. Think of why it means something to you. Maybe a specific memory or a time or an event, or maybe the powerful meaning of the lyrics, or maybe a person who meant or means something to you is what makes that song or hymn special. Think of how that melody coming out of your voice brings you closer to God. Think of the experience of worship you have when you sing, and probably even the experience of worship you're having right now as you think about it. So now let's go back to our criticism of other churches. Only this time, Think of a time you've criticized the choice of music in a worship service, even in your own church worship service. How just hearing the introduction of the song or the sound of the style of the instruments just makes you flinch, right? Your muscles tighten up and you feel disdain because this music is so bad, it shouldn't even be considered for a worship service. Well, guess what? I know exactly how you feel. No, really, I do. I could make you a list of my top 10 songs or hymns that I just can't stand to be used in worship. And guess what else? That's probably not ever going to change for me. But that is okay because, but God. I may not appreciate or even understand how in the world one of these songs on my top 10 worst could ever reach someone, but God does. I may not know how anyone could have a spiritual experience by singing one of those songs in church, but God does. I may not know who in our church could be moved, affected, or inspired by such music, but God does. Knowing this, what if we ask God to help us shift through His grace? What if just for a moment we shifted our attention from the music to the people we love who are sitting with us in our places of worship? Have you ever noticed someone having a moment with God? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't it amazing and wonderful? Have you ever noticed someone having such an experience during one of your top 10 worst worship songs? Could it be that there's more to this music than we first understood? Maybe at some point, we could become conscious of how powerful the experience is that those around us are having, of the intimacy and closeness they are experiencing with God. Maybe as we sit there through another song or hymn that we can't even believe is listed in the songbook or the hymnal to begin with, maybe we can switch our attention from the song to the people. We might just start to notice, at first anyway, that we might smile a little, then maybe even relax in the moment. And maybe when someone sitting just down the road from us starts to have an encounter with the Savior, we might suddenly encounter Him too. In fact, we might even notice that some folks seem to experience the same intensity of an encounter every time they hear this horrible song, no matter how many times they hear or have sung it. Maybe finally something inside of us is able to recognize their joy and the significance of the encounter they're having and even experience it with them. Even though nothing about our opinion about that song has changed, suddenly we're worshiping together. We've talked about how, what other churches do and how that can really be a hot topic issue and how a lot of energy and emotion can be given over to the right way of doing church when, again, presumably someone is being ministered through what that church is doing. It's easy to criticize. We're only human. It's in our nature, which means it's also in our nature to only see things from our perspective, to fall into that consumeristic thinking from the quote that I shared earlier. The same is true about music in worship. Maybe we believe our taste is just better than everyone else's, or maybe we only like a certain kind of style of music in church. Or maybe we might actually like a whole lot of variety of style of music in worship, except for one specific style or type of music that we just really don't like at all. Maybe we're just all a bunch of worship song snobs. But God. Next week, we're going to conclude this 3-part series on songs and expressions by talking about clapping in church. And man, if you thought worship song snob was tricky, just wait. So be sure to tune in next Friday for part 3 in our series and have an awesome week. And let's keep worshiping together. God bless. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Worship Together podcast. Be sure to check out our show notes in the comments below this post for additional information about today's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, help us out by spreading the word about our Worship Together feed and invite your friends and church family to join us at worship-together.com.